Good evening and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dan Sutter with the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. Throughout most of our nation's history, the United States has been blessed to have a rising standard of living. Every generation has been able to have a standard of living much better than that of the generation before it. Yet recently in the United States, some people have suggested that the progress in our growth in real standards of living has come to a halt. To discuss this here tonight, this evening, I have with me my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. Dan Smith. Yeah? Welcome back to the show. Dan, you're on here this evening because you recently chimed in on this issue, on this important issue for us at the CNBC website, and the question of whether or not we've seen a halt to progress or wage stagnation here in the United States, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a piece on wage stagnation, and it stirred up a lot of comments on the website.
Well, to start with, and I think one of the things that many viewers and people find frustrating is when you have people on any issue come back and forth, and they always say, well, this is true, and then they say this isn't true. There's always a question as to whether or not there's any fire to the smoke, and is there any evidence that actually backs up a claim that that could be made that we've seen a halt to progress here in the United States?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of confusion when it comes to measuring living standards over time. And it's important to get to the bottom of it because right now, way that we're viewing trends in living standards is affecting how we craft economic policy. And if we want sound economic policy, we need to really understand how to measure living standards over time appropriately. Unfortunately, a lot of times people don't look at a lot of factors that influence how we measure living standards over time. A couple of these include how public policy affects the growth of living standards over time. If public policy encourages productivity growth, it's going to encourage wage growth. You have to look at taxes and how reporting of income changes over time. You have to look at the forms of compensation and how they change over time. You have to look at how inflation affects living standards. And you also have to look at demographics, how households changed from 1960 to today, if the population is aging, if the type of the structure of the household is changing. All those factors really influence and can affect how we view living standards over time. And if you don't make adjustments for that, looking at living standards over time, you could get misinformed public policy that can actually be detrimental to the groups and segments of society you're trying to help.
Okay. So then starting here, before we've made any of these adjustments, this I think is a graph showing sort of the numbers that folks like to point to say that maybe something's happened here in the United States, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So what a lot of people do is they ignore those factors, or they just don't know about those factors, and they look at just straight median household income, which, as you can see, from the 1960s to today has only seen a 19% gain.
Now, this is inflation adjusted, so this is correcting for any effect of that a dollar's worth a lot less now than in the past, right?
Yeah, well, we'll get more into how we measure inflation, some problems I have with inflation, but this is inflation adjusted using the commonly employed consumer price index. Okay. So 19%
They have
gain.
corrected for that.
Yes.
So there's a slight gain, not the kind of gains we've been used to in the past, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets even starker if you look at wages, average wages since 1960s to today. That has only seen a 6% increase. So from that, that's pretty compelling evidence that wages have stagnated.
Right. And in fact, even earlier there in the early 70s, it's pretty much the same as what we've seen today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of politicians, a lot of policy analysts look at this and say, hey, there's a problem. We have productivity increasing, but wages aren't increasing with them.
Well, although we're probably used to thinking that things are always getting better in the United States because we have a market economy, we've over the years actually deviated pretty far from having a pure market economy in the United States. And so if you look at some of the things, I know we've talked in the past on this show about how our economic freedom ranking has fallen, and certainly if you go back to 1970, we've passed a lot of regulations in the 1970s. There's the whole savings and loan crisis and the housing bubble and everything. So at one level, if you had told me, oh, progress has come to a halt in the United States, I say that there's some plausibility to this. There's some things we've been doing wrong, right?
Yeah, you bring up some really good points, and I think points that people on both sides of the aisle miss out on when talking about living standards and their trends over time. Wages are determined by productivity, and if there's public policy, onerous taxes, or cumbersome regulation that impedes productivity growth, well, you should expect that to affect wage growth as well. Similarly, with K through 12 public education,
right.
If K through 12 public education in America is not equipping American youth with the skills necessary to be productive members of the workforce, well, that's going to affect productivity as well. And then with different crises, we recently had 9/11 and the financial crisis. Mm-hmm. Whatever the cause is of the financial crisis, it's going to affect productivity and thus wage growth. So yeah, there's some reasons why we'd expect actually wage growth to be far less than it otherwise would be if we didn't have those factors contributing to declining productivity.
So there's nothing magic about the United States that says we're always entitled to a higher standard of living. We do have to have the right policies in place. Yeah,
and it's really important to understand what causes productivity to increase and thus mm-hmm. increase wages, and what types of government policies negatively or adversely affect productivity and thus cause a decline in wages.
But still, nonetheless, you argue that these pictures don't quite tell the whole story. So as we start to unpack this, what are some of the factors that these overall numbers here miss?
Yeah, so there's many problems with just looking at wages and salary as a measure of living standards over time. Probably the primary factor that you have to be really concerned and careful with is adjusting for the different forms of compensation. Mm-hmm. So over time, since 1960s, benefits such as more flexible hours, more paid time off, health care, retirement accounts, all of these reduced work weeks, all of these factors have been given to employees by employers as a form of compensation mm-hmm. outside of wages and salaries. In fact, I grabbed a chart from the Federal Reserve Economic Database, and since 1964, these types of benefits, at least one measure of these types of benefits, have increased 175% since 1964. So you're getting a huge chunk of increasing compensation that's not included with wages and salaries.
And so just to make clear for people why it is that benefits and wages or salaries are going to be adjusted from the employer standpoint, that they're looking at their cost of labor, right? That they're like, how much does it cost me to hire this person for an hour? And it's not just their salary.
Yeah, absolutely. So as an employer, if an employee demands or wants some compensation in the form of health care, and some compensation in the form of wages, and some compensation in the form of workplace safety, which we'll talk about, it's the employer has the incentive to provide that compensation in the forms that the employee wants. And just over time, there's been an empirical shift in compensating people more along the lines of these fringe benefits rather than in the form of wages and salaries.
So when we add this to our previous slide here, we saw that all those wages had been stagnating, their benefits have been going up. And so I think our next slide here is going to show us what happens when we put them all together.
Yep. Whenever you add in all those one measure of those benefits into the previous graph that we showed,
here we go.
The increase in, so we showed you the graph before on wages and salaries, mm-hmm. that was 6% increase since 1964. If you look at total compensation, that's increased 45.7%, a much different picture.
So things are still getting better, it's just that people are getting their compensation in sort of other forms, right?
Yes, and people that look just at wages and salaries are missing out on the complete picture, and thus that's leading to misinformed public policy.
Now, healthcare is obviously a big part of this, and you mentioned that, but there are other forms of fringe benefits or things that people might not necessarily think of off the top of their head as fringe benefits that factor into this as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's things, the increase just in variety and choice that consumers have. A person going out for a meal in Troy, Alabama in 1964 probably had very few choices in terms of styles of culinary options as well as the degree of quality. Whereas someone going out to eat in Troy, Alabama today has far more choices. So even in inflation-adjusted terms, person going out to eat in 1964 and today are spending the same amount for the meal, it's more likely that they're benefiting more because they're able to align their consumption habits to their personal preferences in a better way due to the range of quality and styles available to them.
So this is getting into the question of whether the consumer price index is actually measuring costs of living properly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's real problems with that. For instance, if you look at cell phones, they were introduced in 1980s. They're about $5,000 for initial cell phone. It just made calls, poorly at that. When they were, so a worker in 1964 couldn't buy a cell phone no matter what. A worker in 1980 could buy a cell phone if they worked many, many hours for it. And then it wasn't until 1998 that the Consumer Price Index, a popular measurement for, or popular index for adjusting historical wages for inflation, they started including cell phones in their calculations only in 1998. So they failed to account for that drastic increase in consumer well-being that now the average laborer can, with very few hours of work, afford a cell phone and all the benefits that come from it.
And cell phones are just one example. I mean, there are many, many things that people buy today that just wouldn't have been around in 1970 or 1964.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I could show you a graph. One of the better ways to get around measuring inflation. Measuring inflation, even for economists, is really an art rather than a science. It's very difficult to adjust for changing wages, especially with increases in technology. One way to kind of get around that and get a better grasp of how living standards have changed over time in America is look at the number of hours of work the average laborer had to work to earn certain goods, such as a washing machine. So in 1959, the average laborer had to work 100 hours to purchase a washing machine, where today it's only 23.3 hours. Something like a freezer. In 1959, it took 153 hours for the average laborer to be able to purchase a freezer. Today, it's only 17.1 hours. So you can see that the price of these goods is drastically decreasing in terms of the amount of labor required.
Well, and I'm glad to see that because I think I'm going to have to be buying a new washing machine here pretty soon. So good to see. So, but these are still only the products that were in or that were still around back in 1959, right? Because you don't even have like cell phones to possibly think about what a price of a cell phone was.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's where things get really tricky for economists to try to adjust wages in 1964 for a product that didn't even exist until the 1980s. It's very, very difficult to do, and this doesn't account for the increase in quality. A washing machine you buy today, you have far more range and quality and choice, colors, different options than you had available back in 1964. One way to kind of get a grasp or a picture of how well that progress has been is if you look at an ad from Radio Shack in 1991, what it shows that over time, what you get, like all the features of a cell phone, would have cost about $5,000 in today's dollars if you got like the all-weather personal stereo, AM, FM clock radio, in-ear stereo phones, all these things that come packaged with the iPhone that is typically runs, if you go buy an iPhone 4 with contract, I think it's around $100. That would have cost the average worker in 1991 $5,000 in today's dollars.
And this is all stuff that you're now getting in a product that, again, 20 some years ago didn't even exist or wasn't part of the CPI calculations.
Yeah, absolutely. So the real wages of workers has increased because they're able to buy so much more with their hours of labor, yet that's just not reflected in these statistics.
So when these new products are coming along and they start to get introduced into the CPI, do they have the effect then of sort of like inflating what it appears that the cost of living looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. Most economists, and especially most academic economists doing academic work, will not use a consumer price index in their academic work because it's seen as overstating inflation. There's a lot of other forms of adjusting historical wages for inflation that at least get a little bit better at getting a grasp of what's really going on for the average worker. One of those methods is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. And if you adjust the total compensation using that index, instead of, so previously we saw 47 percent increase using the consumer price index. If you use the more appropriate personal consumption expenditure index, that actually increases to 87.21% increase in total compensation from 1964 to 2012.
So just to be clear here, now what we've done is we've taken that the first numbers that we had that seem to show that there's only been a 6% increase in our wages, and now we've adjusted for benefits. So we've added benefits on now, and now we adjust for the cost of living differently and maybe more accurately. And we go from a 6% increase to now like almost a 90% increase, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it really highlights the importance of really carefully looking at this data, because to get appropriate solutions to public policy problems, you really have to get a correct picture of what's going on. And this is saying that, hey, the average worker is actually better off and it's improving over time, which leads to a completely different conclusion than a lot of politicians and public policy analysts looking at just wages and salaries.
And that's of relevance because there's still been evidence that productivity in the United States has been rising, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And when productivity rises, you naturally expect wages to follow. So and there's just a strong empirical relationship. Even the economist Paul Krugman, in one of his books, wrote that there's empirically everywhere throughout history we see a strong relationship between productivity increases and wage increases. And if you want to increase wage growth, you have to increase productivity, and that comes down to encouraging economic freedom. And
so, although despite we've put a bunch of regulations on our economy in the 1970s, and since then that have burdened things, the engine is still chugging along pretty well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It shows how remarkable that engine is for creating prosperity, even for the least off in America. The ability, despite all the regulations, despite all the taxes, that they've still been able to increase workers' real wages is just phenomenal.
Now, there's still another part of this story yet beyond what we've adjusted for, and that's some changes in demographics, right? The household in 1964 is not the same as the household typically now in 2014. So how does that affect this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to look at demographics when it comes to this. And there's several factors that you have to account for, but I think the two most important are first, divorce rates, and second, aging population. So the way we measure household income over time, if you have households splitting up because of an increase in divorce rates, even if individual income is rising, if you're looking at just household income over this time, it may appear to actually go down because you've seen households split up. So accounting for that increased divorce rate is really important to get an accurate glimpse or grasp of what's going on. And then second, an aging population. With an aging population, you have more retirees. Retirees usually live off of accumulated savings. They may hold down part-time jobs, which usually typically pay less even for the same type of work. You would naturally expect a decline in the growth wage if you have an aging population. And in America, we do have an aging population. So that's another factor you have to consider when looking at these growth in living standards over time.
So when you look at the household size, I mean, we just have, even if income per household has roughly stayed the same, that household has fewer people in it now than it did in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably the better way to look at it is to look at individual income growth over time rather than household income over time, because it's so tricky. And also the composition of these households over time have changed, and especially within different quintiles of income growth in America. For instance, households, the top fifth of households in America have far more workers per household and far more people per household than the lower income brackets. And mostly this is due to the retirees living alone, not having a lot of income when they retire. Well, they're not really working that much, if at all, and so that skews the statistics if you don't account for that.
Okay. So we certainly still have some demographics that are, I guess, despite these demographics changes, we're still doing pretty well. Now, there's another side of this, though, that even goes beyond demographics, and that looks at the question of what people were getting paid for doing. And I think the nature of work seems to have been changing over time as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. As people have grown wealthier, they've had the ability to demand certain improvements in the working environment, such as workplace safety, decreasing the chance of fatalities, and that's an important component of total compensation if you really think about it. How much would American worker be willing to pay to have a job that has a lower risk of fatalities than back in the 1960s?
So here's the numbers to get at this, but then we can go into that question in a little more detail, because I think it's an important one to try to stress and make clear for people. So this is just a measure of workplace safety, right?
Yeah, so and this is showing from 1980 to 2012, just the drastic decline in fatalities in the workplace.
And we have more people working now, so I mean the decline in fatalities per worker has been even greater than that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so you mentioned how workplace safety is a part of this equation. So if people were working in a dangerous, unpleasant, stressful job, what's going to happen to their wages?
Yeah, so as you increase your workplace safety, as the employer has to make more expenditures to ensure better workplace environment, safer equipment, more safety equipment, more training, that's all costly. But as employees demand that, the employer has the incentive to provide it, and they're going to provide that as an additional form of compensation in addition to the benefits we talked about and the wages we talked about.
So they'll take some money they could otherwise be paying to workers and make the workplace safer.
Yeah, absolutely. And one way to kind of look at this is, so David Scarbeck wrote a paper about sweatshop workers, and he actually interviewed sweatshop workers and what types of workplace safety they desired and which ones they didn't. And what he found is that most sweatshop workers preferred the less safety in the workplace so that they could save up that money and send their child to school or do other things that they wanted to save up money for, rather than having that increase in safety. However, what you see is that once people become wealthy enough, once they reach a certain level, then they start caring more about workplace safety and in decreasing fatalities in the workplace.
And so to see how this makes, how this factors in, so back in 1970, if somebody was working on what was then a much more dangerous job, they would have been being paid more just because they were bearing the risk. And as the workplace has gotten safer, they would get paid less, or
well, what you'd see is that, what economists call it is compensating differentials.
Mm-hmm.
So it just means that a person that climbs to the top of the radio tower to make adjustments and maintenance on it is going to be paid more for that increased risk of fatality, right? Well, as we've grown through the economy and through technological improvements, we've been able to move away from those dangerous occupations and move into safer occupations with less risk of injury or fatalities. A lot of people have moved into office positions where the biggest thing you have to fear is maybe a paper cut. And that's a big transition, a huge transition in the well-being of the average worker, not to have put their life on the line every time they go to the work.
Well, and it's actually probably been going on for longer than that, because in agriculture, I think the statistics show is one of the more dangerous jobs that one can be in. And back in the day, 40% or more of the workforce was employed in agriculture, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's only through division of labor that was enabled by economic freedom that people were able to transition out of agriculture and into these other occupations that continuously become safer and safer. A good example is like the Iceman. Iceman used to be a very dangerous job. You'd collect ice in the winter on a pond and take it to where consumers wanted it. It's a very, very dangerous job. Well, the invention of the refrigerator allowed people to transition away from those dangerous occupations into a safer occupation like refrigerator repair.
Oh, interesting. I did not realize that the Iceman was a dangerous, such a dangerous position. Oh, so then overall, it looks like things are still doing, the economy is still doing surprisingly well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not saying that everyone in America is doing better off. Another important thing that we didn't talk about today is economic mobility, the ability of people in lower income brackets to move up to higher income brackets. Over time, since the 1960s, we've had an increase in immigration, we've had more people come, they fulfill the bottom ranks, and then the evidence is that they're able to move up over time. There's several studies done in 1970 to the 1980s, 1980s to 1990s, 1990s to 2000 that show that people in the lower class have the ability to move up into higher classes. So while there's certainly people in the lower class and we should be concerned about them, the picture isn't as stark as people make it out to be. And in order to craft well-informed, sound economic policy that's going to benefit everyone, we have to have a clear picture of what's going on with living standards.
So not only are living standards still going up, it's still possible to make it in America, to rise above where you started.
Absolutely. The evidence is crystal clear on that even if you're born in the bottom quintile of American society, you have the ability to move up over time.
And there's a lot of shifting between those quintiles of earnings over time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You see just as much of people in the lowest bracket moving up to higher brackets as you see people in the highest bracket moving down to lower brackets. It's approximately just about the same. So there's a lot of mobility in those income brackets.
So the economy is still vibrant in terms of producing higher standards of living and allowing people to improve their lot in life.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we mentioned, there's still factors that we have to be concerned about. K through 12 education, I think that's leading to decreased productivity. Just the youth in America aren't coming out equipped with the skills necessary to be productive workers. So that's something going forward that has to be examined in order to help the lowest in society move up. The other factor is you have to, so we talked about,
well, the education, I think, is certainly an important one. I mean, we are, after all, more than 30 years since the Nation at Risk first report came out with Bill Bennett back during the Reagan administration, and we haven't really done a lot to correct the problem since then.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other factor was the decline in economic freedom. America was growing, increasing economic freedom. We're relaxing regulations, taking away taxes, and unfortunately, in the last decade, we've really seen a reverse in that trend. And that's a drive, because productivity is the driving force behind wages. Whenever economic freedom is reduced and impedes productivity growth, that's going to end up hurting the pocketbook of the average Americans.
So just very briefly, sort of wrap up here. Now, we've seen more compensation coming in the form of benefits, but now with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, benefits are going to be going up for a lot of workers, or we now have these mandated benefits. Are they going to just have the same, similar effect as the benefits people have been receiving increasingly over the last 40 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Because productivity determines wages, if the government steps in and says, hey, you have to pay these workers more in form of other compensation, and there isn't a concomitant rise in productivity, well, the employer is going to have to reduce another form of compensation, and likely that will be, you won't see as much increase in wages going forward due to the cost of the Affordable Care Act. And unfortunately, this isn't a consumer or employee-driven change, right? If employees want that increased compensation in the form of health care, then the employer has the incentive to provide it. Well, this is government stepping in and saying, we're going to mandate that you get your compensation in this form, reducing the choice of employees to choose how they get compensated. And
possibly then making them worse off because they'll have a less preferred set of benefits versus wages.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. It's been an enjoyable discussion, and I think you'll be for many of our viewers will be glad to hear that things are still improving here in the U.S. economy. Thank you for joining us this evening. Join us again next week for another EconVersations.